My name is Bailey Hall, and at 38, I've carved out a life many would envy. A successful career as a senior financial analyst at a major investment firm, a supportive husband named Mark, and a home filled with quiet routines and small joys. But no matter how much I achieve professionally, or how stable my personal world seems, family gatherings still bring an ache I can't easily shake. A tangled knot of unspoken tensions and invisible battles that play out every time I step through my parents' front door. Thanksgiving this year felt like every other holiday, yet it carried an undercurrent I hadn't fully anticipated. The scent of roasted turkey mingled with the chatter of relatives, and the dining room buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses. I sat at the long oak table, flanked by my parents, Margaret and David, my sister Lauren, and a handful of cousins and aunts. Everyone seemed eager to celebrate, but beneath the surface, a familiar current of favoritism and comparison flowed, threatening to upset the fragile balance. Mom, Margaret, has always had a way of lighting up a room, her voice warm and persuasive, effortlessly drawing people into her stories and social circles. But beneath that charm, she's never been subtle about where her loyalties lie. All year long, she makes it clear that Lauren is the golden child, the star whose every accomplishment is amplified, whose every word carries weight. And Lauren? Well, she plays it perfectly, smiling just so, laughing at the right moments, the embodiment of effortless grace and charm that Mom adores. I, on the other hand, have always been the responsible one, the practical, the steady, the one who quietly fixes problems and covers financial shortfalls without complaint. I'm the one who's paid for unexpected repairs on Mom's car, who's lent Lauren money for rent, and who's kept careful records of every cent. It's a role I accepted without bitterness for years because deep down, I believed that if I just did the right thing, worked hard, supported, sacrificed, my family would come to see and appreciate me. I thought respect would grow from accountability and quiet generosity. But this Thanksgiving, that hope took a hit I wasn't quite prepared for. As the meal wound down, Mom's voice rose above the hum, directing a comment at Lauren that stopped me mid-chew. Lauren is twice the woman you'll ever be. The words hung in the air like a cold draft, sharp and unmistakable. I forced a smile, trying to mask how those 6 words burrowed under my skin. Around the table, forks paused, eyes darted, and I felt the usual humbling sting of invisibility. My presence, my sacrifices, were dismissed in a single sentence. What made it worse was the timing, the casual cruelty wrapped up in a compliment. Lauren beamed, clearly basking in the praise. No one seemed to notice my smile was tight, strained, a fragile mask over the frustration and hurt swelling inside me. I was the one who had quietly bankrolled Lauren's wedding with an $80,000 loan, who managed the family's finances when others faltered. Yet here I was, publicly belittled, overshadowed by the sister who had never shouldered the same burdens. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. I caught my father's eyes, David, usually the passive observer, his mouth twitching in surprise, the spoon in his hand nearly slipping as he swallowed hard. It was a moment suspended in time, a subtle confrontation that no one dared voice aloud. I wanted to say so much, to reveal the truth behind the family's polished facade, but I kept my lips sealed. Instead, I nodded along, the smile never faltering, even as my heart clenched. In that moment, I realized just how deeply I had been underestimated, not just by Mom, but by everyone at that table. The sacrifices I had made, the burdens I had carried, were invisible to them. No amount of professional success or personal strength seemed to matter when weighed against the simple, cruel phrase, "twice the woman." It was a label that cut through years of quiet labor and goodwill, a reminder that in this family, respect and love were measured not by what you gave, but by who you appeared to be. But beneath the hurt, a different feeling was stirring. A seed of something I hadn't allowed myself before. Quiet, simmering resolve. If their view of me was so limited, so skewed by favoritism and blind to reality, maybe it was time I stopped playing by their rules. Maybe it was time to redefine what respect meant, not for them, but for myself. As the laughter resumed and the room brightened again, I sat still, my mind racing beneath the polite smiles and holiday cheer. This Thanksgiving was different, and I could feel the fault lines starting to crack. What happened next, I knew, would change everything. Growing up, Lauren always seemed to glide through life on a tide of charm and privilege, leaving me clinging to the rocky shore of responsibility and quiet sacrifice. From our earliest memories, the differences between us weren't subtle. They were carved into the very fabric of our family dynamic. I remember watching, time and again, as Lauren's sparkling smile opened doors that remained firmly shut for me. Mom would gush over her accomplishments, her social ease, her natural gifts, while I was expected to be the steady hand behind the scenes, the one who kept things running. It was as if Lauren was the dazzling star everyone admired, and I was the shadow, the reliable but unremarked upon backbone. Mom's favoritism was never outright cruel, just persistent and unbalanced. When we were kids, Lauren got the trips to summer camp or dance classes, the new clothes, and the attentive praise for social graces that seemed effortless to her. Meanwhile, I was handed the grown-up chores and the unspoken expectation to be self-sufficient, to absorb the family's stresses without complaint. There was never a thank you for the late nights I stayed up helping with Mom's business paperwork, or the times I drove Lauren to appointments when she couldn't or wouldn't make it herself. Those things were just part of being the responsible daughter, the one who didn't need spotlight or rewards. As we grew older, the pattern only deepened. Lauren's charisma smoothed over any rough edges, allowing her to dodge responsibility with a smile that made everyone forget the messes she left behind. She amassed admiration effortlessly, while I quietly settled loans, paid bills, and bailed out the family when money got tight. The unbalanced ledger wasn't just financial. It was emotional, too. The countless times I put my own needs on hold to support Lauren's plans, dreams, and crises were met with nods or ignored entirely. The idea of fairness was always one-sided. I gave, Lauren took. One memory that sticks with me is from college days. Lauren's tuition was a mountain she never quite climbed herself. I paid for the bulk of it, dipping into savings and tightening my own budget without a word of complaint. I justified it as family duty, telling myself that helping her meant helping Mom and Dad too, maintaining peace in the household. But there was no acknowledgement, no gratitude from Lauren, no recognition from Mom. Instead, the narrative remained fixed. Lauren was the shining example, the daughter who had the world at her feet, while I was just practical and steady, the sensible one who wasn't expected to shine. With each passing year, the weight of this imbalance grew heavier. I taught myself to smile through the dismissive comments and to swallow the sting of invisibility. I rationalized that my sacrifices were worthwhile, that love and respect would eventually catch up to me if I kept doing the right thing. But in truth, the more I gave, the more I felt like an investment that never yielded dividends, in affection, recognition, or fairness. The financial help I extended to Lauren didn't stop at college. Whenever she faced tight spots, rent, emergencies, or wedding expenses, I was there, often without question or repayment. I kept detailed records in my private notebooks, jotting down amounts, dates, and conversations. A silent ledger nobody else seemed to notice. It was my secret way of proving to myself that my generosity wasn't blind or boundless. It was deliberate and measured, but sharing those records was out of the question. Doing so risked shattering the fragile facade that kept family peace. Lauren's entitlement became more pronounced over time, her expectations growing as my patience thinned. It wasn't just about money. It was about being seen, respected, and valued on equal footing. But every holiday, every gathering, was a reminder that the family narrative was firmly written. Lauren was the favored daughter, twice the woman in their eyes, the one who deserved applause. And I was the background player, quietly funding the show but denied any spotlight. Reflecting on all this now, I see how deeply these dynamics shaped me, and how profoundly they hurt. I was raised to believe that family meant selfless giving, that personal sacrifice was its own reward. But at what cost? I sacrificed my own sense of worth, my voice, my dignity, and still, I remained unseen. That Thanksgiving, as the words, "Lauren is twice the woman you'll ever be," cut through the room. They echoed years of this painful disparity. But beneath the surface, a quiet shift was happening inside me. The time for silent sacrifice was ending. The years of being overshadowed, taken for granted, and financially exploited had brought me to a crossroads, a place where I could no longer accept the story written for me. As the conversations and laughter swirled around the table, I sat with a growing clarity. I was done being invisible. It was time to bring these hidden truths to light, not just for my sake, but to reclaim the respect and fairness I'd long been denied. Determined to maintain peace within my fractured family, I quietly assumed the role of caregiver and financial anchor long before Lauren's wedding became a looming expense. It was never a title I sought, but one I accepted with a weary kind of resolve. As Mom and Dad aged, their health slowly became a patchwork of worries: doctor appointments, medication schedules, even the small but relentless tasks that make daily life manageable. I was the one who coordinated it all, scheduling rides, managing bills, and making sure they never missed a payment or a prescription refill. I did it because it felt like what was expected, the responsible daughter who would shoulder the burdens no one else wanted to bear. It wasn't just about logistics. There were countless evenings I spent on the phone with Mom, calming her anxieties over imagined catastrophes or reminding Dad to take his pills. Sometimes, I'd drive across town on a whim to bring them a home-cooked meal or pick up groceries when they couldn't. These acts were invisible to everyone except me, a quiet, steady undercurrent holding the family together. I never sought recognition. I only hoped it would create a foundation strong enough for all of us. So, when Lauren announced her wedding plans, I didn't hesitate. The family's finances were already strained, and I saw the price tag for her celebration ballooning into the tens of thousands, far beyond what the parents could reasonably contribute. Without a second thought, I stepped in and offered an $80,000 loan to cover the costs. It was a substantial sum, one that made me tighten my own budget and sacrifice planned investments and savings. But I convinced myself it was a loan, something Lauren would repay. More than that, I told myself it was an investment in family harmony and in Lauren's happiness. Yet, no conversations emerged about repayment schedules or formal agreements. The loan sailed into the family ledger as a silent but significant transaction, expected, unquestioned. Lauren's charm and Mom's unwavering favoritism ensured that this financial gesture was seen less as a burden on me and more as a natural extension of my responsible role. I was the bank, the safety net, the one who would quietly fix problems while others lived carefree. Behind closed doors, I kept meticulous records, dates, amounts, conversations. Mark, my husband, was my confidant in these moments. He saw the toll it took on me, noticing when I stayed up late balancing budgets, or when the stress crept into my tone. "You're doing too much," he'd say softly, but I brushed it off. I told myself it was temporary, a necessary sacrifice that would eventually be acknowledged. Mark's support was a balm, yet even he struggled to understand the full weight of the invisible labor I carried. My sacrifices didn't stop at the wedding. I was often the one to cover the unexpected household repairs my parents postponed, the emergency vet bills for their aging dog, or the surprise rent payments Lauren sometimes forgot to make. Each time I swallowed the frustration, reminding myself that family meant stepping up, no matter how unappreciated. The pattern was so ingrained that I barely noticed how it chipped away at my sense of self, how it reinforced the narrative that I was the steady backdrop to Lauren's spotlight. In the quiet moments, when the house was still and the world felt less demanding, I'd reflect on the cost of all this giving. I'd wonder if my relentless caregiving and financial support truly bought me the respect I craved, or if it only deepened the invisible walls between us. Lauren's name was always praised at family gatherings. Her glamorous wedding was the highlight of every conversation. Meanwhile, my contributions remained a footnote, whispers behind closed doors. Still, I held on to hope. Hope that if I kept giving, kept sacrificing, the family would eventually see me. Not just as the practical one, but as a woman worthy of love and admiration. But with every holiday, every passing year, it became clearer that my hope was fragile. a delicate veneer over a growing well of resentment. The contrast between Lauren's effortless charm and my quiet diligence framed the story of my family life, and I was beginning to realize that the ending I'd imagined might never come. The wedding loan was a turning point, both a symbol of my generosity and a harbinger of the invisible debts I had accrued. Yet, for now, I kept my secret close. The $80,000 a silent testament to the price I was willing to pay to keep the family together, even if it meant being unseen and undervalued. Last year's family reunion still hangs in my mind like a vivid, painful snapshot, the kind of moment that crystallizes years of frustration into one sharp, undeniable truth. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the sun filtering through the windows of my parents' living room, casting warm patterns on the walls. But the atmosphere was anything but warm. The house was filled with the usual buzz of relatives exchanging pleasantries, children darting between rooms, and the unmistakable clatter of dishes and silverware. I had hoped the gathering would be a chance to briefly set aside the tensions that usually lingered beneath the surface. Instead, it became a glaring reminder of how deeply divided our family really was. Margaret, ever the master of social grace and manipulation, took center stage as she often did. She had that effortless way of commanding attention, her voice lilting with enthusiasm as she recounted Lauren's latest achievements. "Lauren just closed that major client deal at her firm," she announced proudly to everyone gathered, her eyes glittering with pride. "She's really blossomed into an incredible woman, confident, driven, and absolutely radiant. Twice the woman any of us could hope to be." The room responded with polite applause, some genuine admiration, others just going along with the script. Lauren, sitting beside Mom, radiated that easy charm she always did. Her smile was flawless, her posture perfect, as if she were the heroine of the story Margaret was weaving. She basked in the glow of that praise, tilting her head just so, letting the compliments wash over her like the spotlight was meant solely for her. I couldn't help but notice the way the room's energy shifted toward her, as if every eye in the house was tracing her movements, waiting for her next word or laugh. And then there was me, the practical one, the steady one, the one who carried the weight of financial crises no one else wanted to face, the invisible force behind the scenes. When Mom turned her attention my way, it wasn't with the same warmth. Her words were measured, almost clinical. "Bailey is practical. Yes, always the steady hand in the family. But she's never really inspired anyone, has she? She's the one who makes sure the bills get paid, but she's not the one anyone talks about with admiration or excitement." The phrase stung, slicing through the festive air like a cold blade. I felt a sudden tightening in my chest, a familiar knot of frustration and hurt blooming fiercely inside me. My promotion at work, something I had worked so hard to earn, years of late nights, meticulous reports, and strategic decisions, was completely ignored. No congratulations, no nod of acknowledgement. Instead, the conversation circled endlessly around Lauren's glamorous wedding, her social triumphs, and the effortless way she seemed to glide through life's challenges. It was as if my achievements didn't exist, or worse, didn't matter. I tried to speak up, to bridge the growing chasm of recognition. "Actually, I was promoted to senior financial analyst last month," I said quietly, hoping to inject a sliver of my reality into the conversation. But before I could finish, Lauren interjected with a bright laugh, deflecting attention back to herself and her wedding plans. The subtle dismissal was unmistakable. My words evaporated into the background noise, unheard and unvalued. The casual cruelty of that moment was devastating. My family's inability or refusal to see beyond their favored narrative left me feeling profoundly invisible. The countless times I had covered emergencies, the $80,000 loan I had quietly extended for Lauren's wedding, the late nights I spent juggling their bills, all seemed erased in that single evening of public praise and private belittlement. Watching Lauren's radiant smile, basking in the spotlight so effortlessly stolen from me, I felt a bitter mix of envy and resignation. I caught my father's eyes from across the room. David, usually the silent bystander, his expression unreadable, but his lips pressed tightly together. I saw the brief flicker of discomfort when he glanced at me, as though he recognized the injustice, but felt powerless to challenge it. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls narrowing as invisible chains of favoritism tightened their grip. I forced my lips into a smile, careful not to let the hurt show. Inside, I was seething, but externally, I played the role I had been cast in for years. The practical, responsible daughter who kept the family afloat, but never got to enjoy the applause. That night, as laughter and chatter resumed around the dining table, I sat quietly, my mind churning. The invisible ledger of sacrifices I kept, financial support, emotional labor, caregiving, felt heavier than ever. The realization settled in deeply. No matter how much I gave, no matter how indispensable I was, I would always be overshadowed by Lauren's charm and my mother's unwavering favoritism. The sting of that reunion became a turning point, a moment when the facade of family harmony cracked open just enough to reveal the raw, painful truth beneath. The seeds of doubt I had buried for years began to sprout into something stronger, a growing certainty that my worth could no longer be measured by their limited view. As the night wore on and I left my parents' house, the crisp autumn air biting at my cheeks, I knew things had shifted. The weight of invisibility, the silent sacrifices unacknowledged, were no longer something I could carry quietly. Something inside me had changed, though I wasn't quite ready to say what that was. Not yet. It was the kind of moment that doesn't announce itself with fanfare, but quietly reshapes the contours of your life. And as I closed the door behind me, I carried with me the unspoken promise that things would not remain this way forever. Thanksgiving dinner had barely begun when Mom's words hit me like a sudden gust of icy wind. The conversation was light, the usual blend of family banter and polite laughter, but when she said it, clear and unmistakable, "Lauren is twice the woman you'll ever be." The room seemed to freeze for a heartbeat. Everyone stopped mid-chew, forks hovering in the air as the weight of her statement settled like a stone on my chest. I forced my lips into a smile, but inside, a storm was brewing. How could she say that? How could she openly declare in front of everyone that my sister was somehow superior to me, not in some small way, but twice over? The casual cruelty masked as praise was a dagger thrust straight through years of invisible sacrifice and quiet support. I had spent so many holidays swallowing similar comments, brushing off favoritism like a nagging itch that never quite went away. But this time, something snapped. Lauren beamed, perfectly basking in the spotlight Mom had cast on her, the way her eyes sparkled with pride, how she tilted her head just so to soak up the compliments. It made my stomach twist. She had always known exactly how to play the part of the favored daughter, and Mom was her biggest fan. Meanwhile, I sat there, the steady one, the bankroller of Lauren's dreams, the emotional cushion for their troubles, reduced to an invisible shadow. That's when my gaze caught Dad's. David's usual calm demeanor faltered. His mouth twitched, and he nearly choked on a bite of mashed potatoes. The spoon shook in his trembling hand as he swallowed hard, clearly caught off guard by the starkness of Mom's claim. It was the briefest flicker of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that maybe things weren't as perfect as Mom's words suggested. But no one else spoke up. The room remained heavy with unspoken tension. For years, I had carried the family's financial burdens quietly, covering Mom's car repairs, bailing Lauren out of rent crises, and, most notably, footing the bill for Lauren's wedding. The $80,000 loan for that extravagant celebration was my secret ledger, a heavy weight I bore alone. I had kept every receipt, every bank transfer, every whispered conversation about budgets and payments tucked away in my personal files, hidden behind polite smiles and feigned indifference. Now, with the room still holding its breath, I chose to shatter the facade. I cleared my throat softly and looked directly at Lauren and Mom. "Actually," I said, my voice steady but edged with something sharper than usual, "I was the one who privately funded Lauren's wedding, the $80,000 bill that everyone's been so proud to talk about." A hush fell over the room. The clinking of silverware stopped, and even the distant ticking of the wall clock seemed louder. Lauren's face drained of color. She blinked rapidly, caught off guard and unsure how to respond. I could see the surprise flicker in Mom's eyes, a flash of something between disbelief and awkwardness. My father's posture straightened, his eyes fixed on me now, a mixture of embarrassment and silent apology shimmering beneath his usually passive exterior. The cousins and aunts exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable but tinged with the sudden realization that the picture they'd been painting was incomplete, a hidden truth finally surfacing. The warmth in the room collapsed into a brittle silence so profound that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. For a moment, I felt a fierce mix of betrayal and empowerment. Betrayal because the sacrifices I'd made to keep this family afloat had been twisted into invisibility, exploited without a single thank you, a single acknowledgement. Empowerment because I had finally spoken the truth aloud, cutting through years of neglect with one simple revelation. The tension was palpable. Nobody knew quite how to respond. Lauren's usual charm faltered, her smile slipping into a tight line. Mom's lips pressed together, no longer able to command the room's attention as she usually did. Dad cleared his throat awkwardly, his gaze darting between us all, as if searching for a way to mend what had been broken. I sat back, the weight of years lifted slightly by the act of speaking, but the air remained charged. No one dared to break the silence, and yet everything had shifted. Thanksgiving, once a stage for polished smiles and practiced pleasantries, had become an unguarded battlefield. The invisible debts, the hidden sacrifices, they were suddenly out in the open, raw and undeniable. As the dinner resumed, the laughter was quieter, the conversation more subdued. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in with the knowledge I had laid bare. I caught my husband Mark's eye across the table. He nodded ever so slightly, a silent show of support in a moment where I felt both fiercely alone and unexpectedly free. That night, beneath the flickering candlelight and the fading echoes of family chatter, I realized the line had been crossed. There was no going back to the old ways, not after I had finally revealed the expensive, exhausting truth behind the family's perfect image. Whatever came next, the scales had been tipped, and I was no longer willing to be invisible. In the days following that Thanksgiving dinner, the storm inside me refused to settle. At first, grief washed over me like a cold tide. Grief for the years lost to invisible sacrifices, for the quiet generosity that had been met with silence or worse, disdain. I found myself replaying every interaction, every casual dismissal, every pointed glance that had subtly reinforced my place as the practical but uninspired daughter. It was as if I'd been living in a shadow, doing the unseen work that kept the family afloat, always on the edges but never truly inside. Some mornings, I woke to an ache in my chest, a dull, persistent heaviness that no coffee could shake. I caught myself staring out the window at the overcast sky, a reflection of the gray weight settling in my mind. The house felt emptier without my family gathered around, yet their absence did nothing to ease the turmoil within me. Instead, it gave space for thoughts I'd long pushed aside to come forward, demanding attention. I began to pull out my old notebooks, the ones where I'd meticulously recorded every financial transaction I'd made on behalf of the family. There were entries for car repairs, rent payments, emergency phone calls, college tuition installments, and, of course, the details of the $80,000 loan I'd extended for Lauren's wedding. Each line was a reminder of burdens carried alone, of a ledger that no one else seemed to see. The numbers blurred as I flipped through pages, but the weight of them pressed down harder with each reading. It wasn't just the money, it was the emotional toll. The late nights spent soothing my mother's anxieties over the phone, the countless rides to doctor's appointments, the never-ending juggling act of making sure bills were paid on time. These weren't duties I'd volunteered for with joy. They were roles thrust upon me, accepted out of obligation and love, but never truly shared or acknowledged. The more I reflected, the clearer it became. I had been the family's bank, its safety net, and its emotional anchor, all while being treated like a mere background character in a story that spotlighted my sister. Anger began to take root alongside the grief. It was a slow burn, simmering beneath the surface at first, but growing steadily more fierce with every recollection. I felt fury at the injustice of it all, how my sacrifices had been expected, exploited, and then erased. The phrase, "twice the woman," haunted me, no longer just a cutting insult, but a symbol of the deep-seated favoritism that had shaped our family narrative. How could they be so blind to what I had done? How could they celebrate Lauren's charm while dismissing my sweat and tears? The anger sharpened my clarity. I realized that my hope for validation from them had been a fragile illusion. Year after year, I had given and given, chasing a sense of belonging that was always just out of reach. I understood now that their view of me wasn't going to change, not because I hadn't tried, but because it was never truly about me. It was about roles entrenched long ago, about a family dynamic that prized appearance, charm, and favoritism over fairness and gratitude. This dawning awareness was both painful and liberating. Painful because it meant accepting that some relationships might never be as I wished. Liberating because it freed me from the exhausting cycle of trying to earn respect that had been withheld. I told myself quietly, with a new kind of resolve, that I owed them nothing, not apologies, not explanations, not endless support without recognition. For the first time in a long time, I felt ready to stop sacrificing for their approval. Mark noticed the change, though I didn't voice it aloud. He saw how I moved through the house differently, less burdened, yet more guarded. One evening, as we sat together after the kids were asleep, he reached over and took my hand. "Whatever you decide to do," he said softly, "I'm here. You don't have to carry this alone anymore." His words were a balm, but also a call to action. I knew that simmering beneath my grief and anger was a need to reclaim control, to set boundaries that had been missing for too long. I began to plan, not with haste or bitterness, but with the steady logic that had served me in my career. This was about protecting myself and defining the terms on which I would engage with a family that had so often taken without giving back. As I looked out the window that night, the darkness outside no longer seemed oppressive, but filled with possibility. The path ahead wasn't clear, and the road would be difficult, but I was determined to walk it on my own terms. The quiet strength born from years of invisible labor was rising within me, ready to break through the shadows and claim the respect that had eluded me for far too long. In the days and weeks that followed my Thanksgiving revelation, a peculiar calm settled over me. A pause between the storm of emotions and the necessity of action. Grief and anger had done their work, chipping away at my long-held illusions about family and fairness. Now, the time had come to move forward, not in haste or rage, but with deliberate, calculated steps. I understood more clearly than ever that this wasn't just about one dinner or one comment. It was about reclaiming control over the parts of my life that I had quietly given away, piece by piece, to a family that took for granted my generosity. My first task was to map out the full extent of the family's dependence on me. Over the years, I'd absorbed countless financial responsibilities that no one else seemed willing or able to handle. Mortgage payments on the family home, made quietly from my accounts to keep the house afloat, college tuition for my nieces, paid so their parents could manage other expenses, costly repairs on Mom's aging car and the unexpected medical bills that came with it. The ongoing credit card balances accrued by Lauren during her frequent money-tight seasons. Each of these was a thread woven into a complex web of obligation that I had silently upheld. I pulled out my carefully kept notebooks, the ones filled with meticulous records, dates, amounts, account numbers, conversations. Every transaction, every loan, every payment was documented in detail. It was almost like a ledger of invisible labor, a map of all the times I had stepped in so others could live without worry. As I reviewed them, the sheer volume of support stunned me once again. The number of zeros, the months when I had tightened my own budget to cover these costs, it was overwhelming. But this time, instead of feeling crushed, I felt a growing sense of resolve. Not all of this was just financial. There was the logistical caregiving too. Scheduling doctor's appointments for Mom and Dad, arranging transportation, coordinating medication schedules, making sure the house was maintained. I was the family's chief problem solver, the silent linchpin holding everything together behind the scenes. Recognizing this pattern with fresh eyes, I realized how much my life had been shaped and, frankly, limited by this invisible labor. With Mark's steady support, I began to build a practical blueprint for change. We sat together in the quiet of our living room, laptops open, legal documents spread out, and coffee cups half forgotten. Mark, with his calm pragmatism, encouraged me to take protective steps for my own financial security. "You've done enough," he said. "Now it's time to protect yourself and make sure your efforts are respected." We contacted a trusted family attorney, a professional who understood not just the legal intricacies, but the emotional complexities of family dynamics. Together, we reviewed my assets, joint accounts, and current financial commitments. One of the first actions was to separate any joint financial arrangements that could leave me exposed to further exploitation. This included changing the status of certain accounts and ensuring that any future support I provided would come with clear agreements. No more silent loans or unacknowledged handouts. Updating my will was another crucial step. I made the difficult decision to remove Lauren and, eventually, my parents from primary beneficiaries, shifting more of the estate toward Mark and our children. It wasn't a choice I made lightly, but it was necessary to set firm boundaries and protect my family's future. It was a declaration, silent but powerful, that my sacrifices would no longer be taken for granted or assumed as endless. Simultaneously, I began to establish a system to track ongoing caregiving tasks and financial support with greater transparency. I created a shared calendar for medical appointments, medication refills, and bill due dates, something that family members could access, making it clear that these responsibilities were no longer mine alone. By bringing this into the open, I hoped to shift the narrative from me being the invisible, overburdened caretaker to one where accountability was shared. Throughout this process, my demeanor remained calm and composed. Around my family, I continued to smile politely, to engage in conversations, to maintain the semblance of the daughter they thought they knew. But inside, a quiet detachment was growing. This was no longer about pleasing or accommodating their expectations. It was about reclaiming my power, setting boundaries where none had existed, and demanding respect on my own terms. The most difficult part wasn't the paperwork or the legal meetings. It was facing my own fears. What if enforcing these boundaries fractured the family further? What if the people I loved most turned away? But Mark's unwavering belief in me, coupled with my newfound clarity, gave me the courage to press on. I realized that the peace I sought wouldn't come from their approval. It would come from honoring my own worth. As I closed another notebook filled with financial records that evening, I felt a subtle but profound shift. The $80,000 wedding loan, once a secret burden, was now a key piece in a larger puzzle, one where my generosity no longer equated to invisibility. I was ready to navigate the coming challenges with the strategic thinking that defined my career, applying it now to the most personal and fragile of arenas, my family. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I walked it with purpose, not as a silent victim, but as a woman determined to reclaim her narrative, rewrite the rules, and demand the respect she deserved. The quiet shift in my approach to the family wasn't dramatic or confrontational at first. No sudden declarations or fiery ultimatums. Instead, it was a series of subtle, calculated changes designed to protect myself without causing an immediate explosion. I began by letting some things slide that I would have previously jumped on without hesitation. For example, when Lauren casually mentioned she was short on rent one month, I didn't rush to cover it like I always had. Instead, I delayed the assistance, citing my own workload and pressing deadlines. The tight timelines at the office were genuine, but before, I had always managed to push work aside for family. Now, I was drawing a boundary. It was strange at first, this reluctance to be the first responder to every family financial emergency. I remember one evening when Mom called, her voice laced with urgency about a car repair she couldn't afford. In years past, I would have scrambled to arrange payment immediately, but this time I paused. I told her I was swamped with an important project at work and couldn't step in right away. Her disappointment was palpable, but I held firm, knowing I couldn't keep sacrificing without limits. Reducing financial gifts was another subtle but significant shift. Birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries had always been occasions where I quietly slipped money or paid for gifts. I started scaling back, choosing instead modest presents or simply heartfelt cards. Lauren noticed, of course, and while she didn't say anything outright, I caught the flicker of frustration in her eyes. The unspoken message was clear. The safety net I'd provided was tightening, no longer a bottomless pit. Caregiving requests, too, became moments where I exercised newfound control. When Dad asked if I could drive Mom to a specialist appointment, I began to say no more often. Citing urgent meetings or workload pressures, I arranged for them to use community transport services or hired a driver when it was absolutely necessary. But I stopped being the default chauffeur. The burden I'd carried for years suddenly lifted in small increments, replaced by a cautious distance I was learning to maintain. Financially, I started to change account passwords and added additional security measures on joint family accounts. It was a move that surprised me more than anyone else. The sheer act of claiming control over money that had long felt like a shared but unbalanced responsibility was empowering. I notified the banks of changes in authorization, making sure that any withdrawals or transfers would require my direct approval. This was my way of signaling that the old system of silent, unquestioned generosity was over. Around the family, I kept my demeanor calm and composed. To them, I was still the reliable daughter, the calm presence amid their chaos. But beneath that surface, a quiet detachment grew. I was no longer scrambling to fix their problems on their timetable, or absorbing their crises without question. Each time I declined a request or delayed a loan, I felt a small victory, a reclaiming of my own life and resources. At first, some family members shrugged off these changes as temporary or the result of my busy schedule. Lauren, in particular, seemed to dismiss my growing reservations as a passing phase. "Bailey's just stressed from work," she'd say with a patronizing smile when others noticed the difference. But I knew this wasn't stress. It was a deliberate, steady stepping back. I was setting the stage for bigger changes to come. The tension simmered quietly. Conversations became more guarded, requests more cautious. I sensed behind polite questions and casual comments a growing unease, a recognition that the old flow of resources and favors was no longer as easy or automatic. Yet no one could quite put their finger on what was shifting. I continued to wear my smile like armor, answering inquiries with practiced neutrality and deflecting probing questions about finances or caregiving with vague but firm responses. One evening, Mark noticed the change in me more clearly than anyone else. As we sat together after the kids were asleep, he said gently, "This isn't just about work, is it?" I shook my head, feeling a mix of relief and resolve. "No, I'm done letting them take without giving. It's time to stop being the family ATM and the unpaid caretaker." His nod was steady, his support unwavering. "Then let's make sure it sticks," he said simply. In those moments, I felt the weight of years begin to lift. The delicate balance of giving and sacrifice that had defined my family role was cracking. I was learning not just to say no, but to enforce it. And while the path ahead was uncertain and fraught with potential conflict, I knew that this subtle detachment was the first step toward protecting myself and finally demanding the respect I deserved. The stage was set, the fault lines quietly spreading beneath the surface. What no one realized yet was how thoroughly I was preparing to change the story of our family, for good. The moment I decided to formally demand repayment of the $80,000 loan felt like stepping onto a stage I had avoided for far too long. I knew the timing was critical, not just to reclaim my finances, but to assert boundaries that had been ignored for years. The weight of invisible debts and silent sacrifices had grown unbearable, and it was time to bring everything into the light. After days of quiet contemplation and consultation with my attorney, I drafted a letter addressed to Lauren and both of my parents. I chose my words carefully, measured but firm, knowing this document would serve as a boundary marker and a record of my intent. In it, I outlined the full sum I had lent for Lauren's wedding, specifying the dates and amounts with the precision I always applied to my financial work. I reminded them that this loan was never a gift, but a responsibility Lauren agreed to repay, an agreement that had been neglected, conveniently erased under layers of charm and denial. I also made it clear that, moving forward, I would be withdrawing further financial support. No more covering overdue bills, No more secretly footing the costs of household repairs or unexpected emergencies. This was not punishment, but protection, a necessary step to preserve my own financial security and emotional well-being. The letter concluded with an explicit notification that Lauren and my parents would be removed as beneficiaries from my will, and any joint accounts would be separated as part of this realignment. It was a declaration that the days of silent sacrifice were over, and mutual respect had become non-negotiable. I remember the morning I sent that letter. The air was crisp, the sky a pale blue that promised clarity. Sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside me, I clicked send with a mixture of dread and relief. I could almost hear the quiet ripple that message would send through the family's carefully maintained facade. Within hours, the fallout began. Lauren called first, her voice a mix of shock and disbelief, peppered with that familiar tone of entitlement. "Bailey, this isn't how family works," she said, attempting to guilt-trip me with rehearsed lines about love, sacrifice, and sisterly support. But this time, I didn't flinch. I calmly reiterated that this was about accountability, a concept long absent from our dynamic. "I've done my part," I said firmly. "Now it's time for you to do yours." Mom was next. Her usual warmth was replaced by a brittle edge. The social grace that once disarmed any opposition was gone, replaced by thinly veiled frustration. She tried to charm her way back into influence, reminding me of family ties and the importance of unity. But the truth was clear. The unity she preached was one-sided, and I was no longer willing to play the role of the invisible provider. Dad's reaction was more subdued, but no less significant. I caught him in a quiet moment, his usual passivity giving way to a nervous tremor. He admitted, in a low voice, that the family had become too reliant on me. It was the first time I heard him acknowledge the imbalance, though he stopped short of offering any support to change it. His silence after that was a heavy weight, the quiet complicity of a man caught between love and inertia. Withdrawing financial support wasn't just about money, it was about reclaiming my life. I stopped paying the mortgage installments on the family home that I'd quietly covered for years. I halted the tuition payments for my nieces that had been mine by default. I refused to settle the creeping credit card debts Lauren racked up without hesitation. Each cessation felt like a small, silent earthquake, shaking the foundation of their comfortable dependence. I also moved swiftly to separate joint accounts, changing passwords and notifying banks that any transactions required my direct consent. It was a painful but empowering step. No longer would I be the unwitting guarantor of their financial whims. By updating my will to remove Lauren and my parents, I sent a clear message that my resources were no longer limitless, nor was my generosity a given. Throughout this upheaval, I maintained a calm exterior. At family gatherings, I smiled politely, engaging in conversations with practiced ease, but inside, a quiet resolve burned. I was no longer the invisible backbone. I was a woman who had finally drawn a line in the sand. The shock was evident. Lauren's usual confident composure cracked. I saw her struggle to mask frustration and panic behind rehearsed smiles. My mother's charm faltered, replaced by thinly veiled resentment. Even Dad seemed more distant, caught between embarrassment and helplessness. For the first time in years, the family dynamic shifted visibly. The once unspoken rules, that I would bear their burdens silently, were broken. And while their reactions ranged from anger to pleading, I stood firm, knowing this was the long-overdue reckoning. In that moment, I understood that the path ahead would not be easy. The family I had tried to hold together was fracturing under the weight of truth and accountability. But I also knew that reclaiming my worth and setting firm boundaries was the only way forward, because respect, I realized, must be earned, not demanded by blood or obligation. As the echoes of that decision rippled through our lives, I braced myself for what was to come. The quiet storm I had unleashed was only just beginning. The moment I sent that letter demanding repayment of the $80,000 wedding loan, I knew the calm before the storm was over. It was like dropping a stone into a still pond. The ripples spread quickly, touching everyone in my family, and the surface of our relationships fractured almost immediately. Within hours, my phone buzzed. Lauren's name glowed on the screen, and when I answered, I could hear the disbelief dripping from her voice. "Bailey, how could you do this? Family isn't about money. It's about love, support. Don't you get that?" she pleaded, her tone a blend of hurt and entitlement. I stayed firm. "Lauren, this isn't about trying to hurt you. It's about accountability. You agreed to repay that loan, and it's time to honor that commitment." Her voice cracked. She tried to turn on the guilt. "I thought you cared about me. I've done so much for this family." I swallowed down the impulse to argue. Years of being the family's invisible financial anchor gave me clarity. I had done enough. This wasn't a punishment. It was a boundary. Long overdue. Almost immediately, Mom called. The warmth in her voice was gone, replaced by a brittle edge. The social charm I once admired now sharpened like a weapon. "Bailey, you're being unreasonable," she insisted. "We're family. This isn't how we solve problems. Think of your father's health. Think of the holidays." But beneath her words lurked thinly veiled frustration and a veiled threat of emotional withdrawal. The mother who once wove us together was now trying to unravel me. I kept my voice steady, carefully deflecting her pleas. "Mom, I'm protecting myself now. I can't keep doing this alone." The line went quiet. I could almost hear the wheels turning as she realized I was no longer the safety net she could rely on without question. Then came Dad's response. Unlike Mom's fire, his was hesitation and awkwardness. He admitted quietly, almost in a whisper, "Bailey, maybe we leaned on you more than we should have." His confession was layered with guilt, but also helplessness. He wanted to bridge the growing gap, but didn't know how to step in. His silence afterward spoke volumes. He was caught between loyalty and inertia. The financial strain hit them hard and fast. Mortgage payments I'd been covering without mention suddenly went unpaid. The family home, a symbol of our childhood and shared history, now faced real risk. College tuition for my nieces, once my silent responsibility, stopped arriving on time. The stress that had been hidden beneath polite smiles burst into the open. Lauren's usual confidence wavered under pressure. I heard through mutual friends that she was scrambling, trying to keep up appearances while her financial safety net unraveled. It was a jarring contrast to the poised, unshakable woman everyone admired. The entitlement that had once shielded her now left her vulnerable, exposed to reality. Margaret's health, always a delicate subject, declined noticeably under the weight of stress. I wasn't there for daily check-ins anymore, and the emotional toll showed. Her once vibrant energy dimmed, replaced by a brittle weariness. It felt like the family's foundation was cracking beneath our feet. Yet, through the barrage of guilt-laden calls, tearful apologies, and desperate pleas to make things right, I held my ground. My resolve was steel. This was about respect and fairness, not enabling harmful dynamics, the usual manipulation tactics, playing the victim, invoking family loyalty, threatening estrangement, came and went, but they no longer held power over me. Even family friends began to notice. Whispers about the Hall family's troubles floated through social circles, a quiet shift in perception that unsettled Margaret deeply. The polished exterior was cracking, revealing a family grappling with dysfunction and accountability for the first time. Amid the chaos, I felt a strange mix of isolation and liberation. These weren't easy days. Seeing those I loved struggle, knowing I was a catalyst, weighed heavily on my heart. But I also knew that enduring the discomfort was necessary to break free from a cycle that had sapped my spirit for too long. Lauren, once the golden child basking in unearned praise, was now forced to confront limits. Her entitlement met consequences she hadn't anticipated. The financial safety net I'd long provided was gone, and with it, the cushion that had allowed her to glide over hardships without real accountability. As calls and messages flooded in, I stayed firm, yet calm. I refused to be moved by tears or threats. My focus was clear. Boundaries were non-negotiable. Respect was earned, and the old patterns had to end. The family's struggle was raw and painful, but beneath the turmoil, I sensed the first tremors of change. The reckoning I'd set in motion was unfolding, not with fanfare or drama, but with the slow, deliberate unraveling of old wounds and the painful birth of new realities. And so, even as the panic swirled around me and the family grappled with the fallout, I held on to the quiet certainty that this was necessary. The old story of silent sacrifice and invisible labor was ending. The next chapter, fraught and uncertain, was already beginning. The first foreclosure notice arrived like a cold slap in the face. A stark paper envelope slipped under the family mailbox, its bold, impersonal lettering announcing a crisis we could no longer ignore. I wasn't the one who opened it, but the news traveled fast, swirling through whispered phone calls and muted conversations. Mom sounded different on the phone that evening, her usual composed charm giving way to something brittle, fragile. The stress was settling visibly on her shoulders, a subtle paling of her complexion that no makeup could mask. Margaret had always been the picture of grace and social poise, this unshakable matriarch who kept the family's image polished and intact. But now, under the weight of the mounting financial strain, I saw cracks forming, tiny tremors beneath the facade. Her sharp tongue, once used to wield power and shape perception, faltered. The carefully curated smiles slipped into tired sighs, and the proud spark in her eye dimmed. Replaced by a flicker of worry, she tried desperately to hide. David, my father, was caught somewhere between disbelief and helplessness. His usual passivity seemed to grow heavier with every new piece of bad news. I noticed his hands trembling slightly as he went through the mail on another day, the letters from the bank piling up like silent accusations. He cleared his throat often, avoiding eye contact, as if the reality was too much to face head-on. Yet, even in his quiet, there was an undeniable tension, a mixture of frustration, regret, and exhaustion that I hadn't seen before. Lauren's social circle, the one that had always adored her effortless charm and confident smile, began to murmur differently. I heard through a mutual friend that whispers were circulating, questions about how she was managing now that the generous safety net I once provided was gone. It was almost surreal, the way a few missed payments spiraled into rumors that chipped away at Lauren's carefully maintained image. The poised and radiant woman everyone admired was suddenly showing cracks, forced to confront vulnerabilities she'd long avoided. At family gatherings, the atmosphere shifted. The laughter became more strained, conversations more guarded. I watched Lauren struggle to maintain her composure, her usual spark flickering as she fielded awkward inquiries about the house and the mounting bills. The entitlement that had once insulated her from consequences now felt like a weight pressing down, and the absence of my financial support was a palpable absence, like a missing pillar in the shaky structure she'd relied on. Margaret's health, always somewhat delicate, declined noticeably under the relentless pressure. Her shoulders stooped more, her voice lost some of its usual melody, and there was a weariness in her eyes I hadn't witnessed before. I wasn't there for every moment. Mark and I had begun to distance ourselves, but in the rare phone calls I received, there was a tremor of vulnerability, an unspoken plea that went unanswered. The crack in her armor was a sobering reminder of how much responsibility I had carried for so long, and how the withdrawal of my support sent shockwaves through the family's fragile equilibrium. David's frustration grew, though he remained trapped in his own passivity. I caught him once in the kitchen, pacing with a furrowed brow, muttering about how we got here and what we should have done differently. But he stopped short of action, caught between wanting to help and feeling powerless to change the course. His silence after those moments felt like a heavy fog descending on the house, a shared weight that none of us could shake. The usual family tactics, pleading, guilt-tripping, veiled threats of estrangement, were launched against me in waves. Mom's voice, once warm and persuasive, became sharper, laced with thinly veiled resentment. "We're all suffering, Bailey," she would say, each time trying to draw me back into the cycle of sacrifice. Lauren's calls were desperate and demanding, her entitlement unchecked even in crisis. "You don't have to do this," she'd say, tears barely hidden beneath practiced tones. But I stood firm, my resolve hardening with each attempt to manipulate. Friends and extended family soon noticed the shift. Conversations I overheard at social gatherings hinted at concern and surprise. Questions about the Hall family's sudden unraveling, the whispered speculation about money troubles, and fractured relationships. The polished exterior I'd helped maintain for years was crumbling, revealing a family grappling with long-standing dysfunction and the painful consequences of accountability. Through it all, I found myself caught in a strange blend of isolation and liberation. The weight of the fallout pressed down heavily, watching the people I loved struggle, knowing my actions had set off this chain reaction. Yet beneath the discomfort was a fierce satisfaction. I was no longer complicit in enabling a toxic cycle. Boundaries were being drawn, and respect was being demanded on terms I defined. Lauren's entitlement, once a shield, now met real consequences. Stripped of the financial cushion I'd provided, she faced the world with fewer guarantees, her social circle whispering, her confidence shaken. The family I'd once tried so hard to support was fracturing, but I knew the fractures were necessary, painful as they were, to break free from years of invisible labor and unbalanced sacrifice. As the days passed and the family grappled with the fallout, I remained calm but resolute. The gentle but firm barrier I placed was non-negotiable. They could choose to grow and heal or remain trapped in the roles they'd long embraced. For me, the quiet strength of boundaries was a new kind of freedom, one I was finally ready to live by. Establishing firm boundaries with my family wasn't a single act, but a continuous commitment, shaped by years of invisible sacrifices and unspoken resentments. After the turbulence unleashed by my Thanksgiving revelation and the subsequent financial stand I took, I knew that any future contact would need to rest on solid ground: mutual respect, transparency, and equal accountability. These weren't mere words. They were the pillars upon which I needed to rebuild my relationship with the Hall family, a relationship that had been fractured by favoritism and exploitation. The first step was redefining what I was willing to accept from them. I made it clear, though not always openly verbalized, that respect meant more than platitudes or empty compliments. It meant acknowledging my contributions without diminishing or comparing them, and it meant honoring commitments, financial or emotional, with honesty and follow-through. Transparency became non-negotiable. No more hidden debts, no more secret loans, no more unspoken expectations that I would simply fill the gaps. From now on, if there was a problem, we would address it openly, with clear agreements and shared responsibility. Accountability was perhaps the hardest boundary to enforce, because it cut through decades of enabling and passive acceptance. Lauren and Mom, in particular, had thrived on a family dynamic that let them lean heavily on me without consequence. But I was done being the invisible bank and emotional caretaker. If they wanted my support, whether financial, emotional, or practical, they had to meet me halfway, not just take without giving back. This meant that unpaid debts would no longer be silently absorbed, missed commitments would be called out, and promises broken would carry weight. It was a radical shift from the unquestioned generosity I had offered for years. This new framework didn't come with a dramatic announcement or a public confrontation. Instead, it was embodied in every interaction, every decision I made going forward. I politely declined calls for last-minute financial help when the requests were vague or unplanned. When Lauren asked for favors without clear purpose, I suggested alternatives that required her to take more responsibility. I insisted on formalizing any future loans or expenses with written agreements, a practice that felt strange, but necessary to protect my own peace of mind. At family gatherings, I no longer tolerated dismissive remarks or backhanded compliments without calmly addressing them or excusing myself when needed. The lines were drawn in everyday moments. Choosing where to focus my energy became an act of self-preservation and love. Mark stood steadfastly by my side, his steady presence a balm amid the storms of family drama. Together, we cultivated a home environment filled with open communication, shared responsibility, and mutual respect, everything I had longed for but rarely found in my childhood household. Our children thrived in this atmosphere, witnessing healthy boundaries and learning that respect is earned through actions, not titles or bloodlines. Friendships outside the family also gained new importance. I nurtured connections with people who valued honesty and reciprocal care, whose support was genuine and free from the complicated webs of family history. These relationships provided emotional sustenance and reminded me that my worth wasn't defined by the Hall family's skewed perceptions. I began to carve out more time and mental space for myself, something I had neglected for years under the weight of caregiving and financial demands. Quiet mornings reading before work, weekend walks with Mark, and moments of stillness became essential rituals to ground me. In these pockets of calm, I rediscovered my identity beyond being the responsible daughter. I was a woman with dreams, strengths, and boundaries worth defending. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of change within the family, subtle shifts that hinted at reflection or regret. A hesitant apology from Mom, a cautious attempt by Lauren to manage her finances more carefully, or a quiet word of thanks from Dad suggested that my firm stance was not without ripple effects. But I also accepted that some patterns might never fully change, and that was okay. My responsibility was no longer to fix them, but to protect myself and those I loved. Establishing these boundaries transformed how I showed up in family spaces. I felt lighter, more authentic, no longer weighed down by the need to conceal truths or absorb injustices silently. Conversations that once left me depleted now held room for honesty, or, if necessary, graceful withdrawal. I learned that walking away from toxicity wasn't betrayal. It was self-respect. This journey wasn't linear or easy. There were moments of doubt, pangs of loneliness, and the occasional ache for the family I'd hoped we could be. But each challenge reinforced why these boundaries mattered. They were the armor that allowed me to stand tall, and the foundation for new kinds of relationships built on fairness and respect. Looking ahead, my focus remained clear: to nurture the family I had chosen, Mark, our children, and trusted friends, while holding space for healing and accountability with my birth family, on terms that honored my worth. This was not about severing ties, but about rewriting the script, stepping into a role where I was seen fully and valued genuinely. In the quiet strength of these boundaries, I found freedom, a peace born from choosing self-respect over approval, certainty over doubt, and personal truth over family lore. The journey continues, but now I walk it with my head held high, knowing that respect is never owed. It is earned, nurtured, and fiercely guarded.